Okay, Mike, if I kick things off. So good afternoon, everyone, and a warm welcome to today's session on rural Ontario's population growth during COVID-19. Welcome. I'm Ellen Sinclair. I'm the Executive Director of the Rural Ontario Institute. And we're pleased to be partnering today with the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs, OMAFRA, on this very timely discussion. Before I introduce our speakers, we'd like to get an idea of where you're from. So we're going to put up a quick poll on the screen. It's just one question. What kind of organization are you with? So Bree, I'll ask you to launch the poll and please let us know the results when you have them.
All right, so we have about 8% business, 11% nonprofit or charitable organization, 31% local government municipality, 22% provincial or federal government, 8% university, college, or school, 11% economic development organization, and 3% professional association. So I'll close the poll now.
Thanks very much, Bree, and thanks everyone for helping us out to sort of identify where folks are from. We're all here today because the COVID-19 pandemic has led to an increase in rural migration, an increase in demand for rural housing and rural house prices. And this trend is not unique to Ontario. There are reports of similar trends occurring across our country and across the US. So this workshop today is going to provide an opportunity for all of us to discuss and better understand these trends and their economic development implications. We're going to start today's session off with a panel of expert speakers. We welcome representatives from the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs, from Strategy Corp and Dufferin County. And our panelists are going to provide presentations on the information that we need to better understand the issues. This will be followed by breakout sessions, which will be facilitated discussions and where we can all explore and share details on how these trends are impacting our different rural areas, including the economic development impacts of the pandemic with a focus on population and housing trends. So that's the format for today. It's now my pleasure to welcome and introduce our three expert panelists. We'll start with John Anania. John's an economist with over 25 years of work experience as a researcher and forecaster. He began his career as an economist with the Canadian Projection Group at the Bank of Canada before moving to positions at the Conference Board of Canada and the Royal Bank. At the Royal Bank, he was assistant chief economist, and he managed a team producing the bank's global economic and financial market outlooks. His home position is currently the manager of the Economic Forecasting Unit at the Ontario Ministry of Finance, where for the last 6 years, he's overseen the production of the budget and internal staff forecasts. He's currently on a 12-month assignment as acting manager of the Economic Analysis Unit at OMAFRA. So welcome, John, and thank you for being here today. Our second presenter is Mitchell Davidson, who is the Executive Director of the Strategy Corp Institute of Public Policy and Economy, a venture designed to contribute to thought leadership on important public policy issues in Ontario and Canada. And in this role, Mitchell has authored numerous policy white papers and articles, And he also hosts the Institute's bi-weekly podcast, Intended Consequences. And our third presenter today is Cody Jodrey. Cody is the newly appointed Director of Development and Tourism at Dufferin County, and he has nearly 15 years of experience in municipal government. Much of his career has been dedicated to understanding and developing solutions to challenges in rural communities, including those around housing, workforce, broadband, agriculture, tourism, and municipal amalgamation. So Cody is passionate about building connections and developing strategies to address foundational issues and create meaningful change through simple and elegant solutions. And so I welcome all three presenters today. Thank you for being here and sharing your expertise with us. We are looking forward to the information that you have to share and to helping us to better understand some of these issues that we're facing in rural Ontario. At this time, I'd also like to welcome Mike Florio from the Economic Development Policy Branch at OMAFRA. And Mike is going to be moderating the panel today. So Mike, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ellen, and thank you all for joining us today. We're really looking forward to this workshop. So as Ellen mentioned, there's two parts to the workshop. The first part, John, Mitchell, and Cody are going to be sharing some of their research and analysis about the pandemic-related rural migration trends and the economic development impacts. And the second part, the second hour, will be dedicated to a group discussion facilitated through breakout rooms related to what you were all seeing in your communities related to these trends and the economic development impacts. It is quite an aggressive agenda we have planned. So the speakers have asked if you could please hold your questions until the end of the last presentation, and then we'll hopefully have time, about 10-15 minutes for questions before we then go into the breakout rooms. So thank you all for joining us. I look forward to the session, and John, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you, Mike, and hello, everyone. Am I showing in presenter view right now?
You're good, John.
I'm good? Okay, perfect. All right, so thanks for the wonderful introductions there. So let's, we have a limited amount of time, as Mike was mentioning, for these presentations. So let me jump right into the presentation here. Okay. So, you know, as policymakers, the last year and a half has been quite interesting to us. And one of the things that we've seen is a great interest in what's going on in communities surrounding major urban centers in Ontario. And if you look at the map here that I'm presenting, the area of study of interest for us, as you can see, there is the brown area in the province. So we're excluding the big urban centers, the Toronto CMA, and the Ottawa CMA as well. So we're not particularly focusing just on purely rural Ontario here. We're also capturing the smaller urban markets within the province, where we've seen, you know, a pretty substantial and observable divergence in trends with the big urban centers. Okay, so let me just highlight. Hold on one second here. Really, what struck us when we started looking at this is what was going on with the housing market. And let me highlight the trends here. These are a breakdown of areas based on real estate boards for the province. It's a heat map of resale house prices. And the lighter colors you can see there based on the legend are areas where price increases between the pre-pandemic period, which is February 2020 to September 2021, have been the lowest. So the interesting thing with this heat map here is that it shows there's been a big divergence between house price appreciation in the urban centers like Greater Toronto, Mississauga, Oakville, York, Ottawa, and the surrounding communities. In fact, we've seen price increases, and I'm sure many of you are aware of this here, in the range of, you know, touching 100% if you look north into some cottage country. And, you know, on average, you know, price increases in here ranging at about 50% or even more in some regions. Now, this is somewhat unusual. We haven't really seen trends like this in the past. But the thing to note here is that this reversal in trends, where we're seeing higher price appreciation in surrounding communities, really started to begin in 2016. In fact, it predates the pandemic. And let me highlight to you how unusual this is. If you look at house prices in the Toronto, Greater Toronto area, and this is the CREA definition here, that's the dotted red line, and you compare it to prices in the other regions of the province, and here we've taken an average price weighted on sales. You can, and if you look back to the 1980s, 1990s experience, you can see the typical pattern for housing markets in the province are where markets, in Toronto tend to overheat for housing in a boom period. And that's what you saw in the late 1980s. There's a correction that occurs in the early 1990s. A recession occurred. The market was overbuilt at the same time. Prices drop in Toronto. They also drop in the rural communities, but because they didn't rise as much and because there wasn't as much froth in the market, they don't decline as much in the downturn. And then what you see in the period after that is a reconvergence of house price appreciation, where on average, house price appreciation tends to be a little bit hotter in Toronto than surrounding communities for a number of reasons. Now, if you look at the period today, what's unusual is that we've had a very strong housing market in Toronto, and that's the red line. And it was running above what we saw in rural communities. But in 2017, with the introduction of the Fair Housing Plan in the province, there was a correction in Toronto. House prices actually fell for a period of time. They also came down a little bit in rural communities, and that's as expected. But what's unusual is that starting in 2017, 18, 19, and 20, house price appreciation now, on average in these regions, has been stronger than it has been in Toronto. And that trend tends to persist to the current time period. And again, looking at this chart, you would expect that at some point you get a reconvergence of these price trends, but we're not seeing that right now. So as policymakers, we need to understand what the drivers of this divergence is. And that's what we sought to do. And these are the findings that we're going to present today, is to highlight for you what we think is the major driver behind this trend. Okay, so obviously one of the big ones is population. And the chart on the left there shows Ontario's non-major urban market population in level terms. The chart on the right shows it in growth rates. So you can see that the interesting thing is that population growth in surrounding communities really started to accelerate in 2016, where it jumped over 1% to over 1%. And it's remained strong ever since. And I'll have a lot more to say here in just a second about that last data point there in 2020. This is official StatScan data that I'm presenting. Now, based on internal conversations and conversations that we also have with other researchers, the three main reasons tend to jump out for the acceleration in population growth starting in about 2016. But one of them would be, a retirement of baby boomers moving out from the urban centers into surrounding communities. Improvements in transit also come into play in terms of goal lines. But the overwhelming reason, in our opinion, and an important one here, is the fact that house price appreciation was very strong in Toronto. And we've hit levels of affordability now that are triggering an out-migration from the Toronto CMA to surrounding communities. And that really began in 2016. In 2016, we saw the biggest jump in house price appreciation in the Toronto CMA in about 3 decades, where it jumped from about 9.5% to 17.5%. So it nearly doubled the pace of house price appreciation over that period of time. And that's precisely when non-major urban population growth started to accelerate. Now, in terms of the drivers, there's a few points to make here as you delve into the data, because there are some interesting pieces that come into play here. If you look at this chart, it shows the net out-migration from Toronto, because it loses people every year to surrounding communities here, going back to 2000, that's the yellow bar. And the green bar is the change in population in non-major urban markets. And you can see that in the early 2000s there, about 2/3 of the population growth in non-major urban markets was associated with out-migration from the Toronto CMA. Now, about 1/3 of that was still from natural causes, right? Natural births, net increases in population. But since then, and this trend has emerged now since about 2007, 2008. Since then, most of the population growth, okay, in surrounding communities is really at source coming from Toronto, where the net out-migration almost matches 1-for-1 the increases in population growth in these non-major urban markets. And you can see that the out-migration from Toronto really started in 2016 and has been the driver of population growth over this period of time. The really interesting thing to note here is that you can see in 2016, 17, 18, 19, and 20, the big increases that we saw in population in surrounding regions are unusual and really came from Toronto. Now, if you look at the period of 2020 there, this is very interesting. And this is where we've done a lot of work, is to try to understand what's going on in 2020. Because if you look at the official StatScan data in 2020, it reports a 50,000 out migration from Toronto. And that in and of itself is not unusual, because we've seen levels of that magnitude in the previous 3 years, right? And as it turns out, the StatScan data released for 2020 came out in the summer of 2021, or yeah, in about summer 2021, uses estimates for intra-regional migration that are based on previous year trends. So the key thing to note here is that the StatScan data right now doesn't incorporate the impacts of the pandemic. So if you look at official StatScan data, and this has been reported in the press, in the press, they picked up on this, that 50,000 out migration from Toronto in 2020 was a record. It was in fact due to the pandemic. Well, it was a record, but the impacts of the pandemic were not factored in. So we have to do some work here on our side to try to estimate the impacts of the pandemic. By the way, we will get good official data from StatScan when the next census is released, and that will be next year. And there we'll have the proof in the pudding, because the census is very comprehensive and it will capture the impacts of the pandemic. But until then, we have to do our own estimates. And that's what we did here. And I haven't included all the quantitative research that we've done to get at these stats, because I'm sure it would bore you and it gets pretty tricky, but I'll just say a few words on it. We have very good data on the housing market, specifically when it comes to house prices, right? So what we did is we built a model of house prices in these non-major urban markets based on 4 factors: population growth, average household income, mortgage rates, and changes in supply. And based on that regression work that we did, we were able to flip it on its head and isolate population and just say, okay, if prices are rising at this rate, what kind of population change do you need to generate that kind of an increase in house prices? Because one of the other things that we found is that mortgage rates and household income, and also changes in supply, don't tend to be significant drivers in these markets of house prices. It really tends to be population. So we were able to flip that relationship on its head. And what we found out is that it's telling us right now that population growth in these non-major urban markets is rising at about 2% a year. Okay, and that's the red line that you see on the chart on the left there. The official StatScan data says it's about 1.2%. But when you factor in the impacts of the pandemic, it's likely closer to 2%, or somewhere in the range between 1.2 and 2%. And if you look at the chart on the right there, the big red bar shows the net out migration from Toronto in 2020. And we think it could range anywhere from 50,000, the official StatScan estimate, to about 80,000, based on our own regression work. And that would go to a long ways into explain what we're seeing with those housing markets. Okay. One thing I'd like to mention too is that house price appreciation remains strong in surrounding communities. Okay, and this is the heat map again from December 2019 to December 2020. And you can see we have darker colors surrounding the major urban centers. Now, if you look at the period of this year, hold on a second. There we go. The dark colors disappear a little bit. Now, this is not an entirely fair comparison here, because we don't have a full year in 2021 just yet, but you can see that house price appreciation in some of these regions now has cooled off a little bit. It's still stronger on average than it is in Greater Toronto and Ottawa, but there's been a little bit of a deceleration in house price appreciation in 2021. And that would suggest to us that if you look at population growth, now this is the same chart I was showing earlier, but with a little bit of a forecast or a scenario going forward to 2025. What the very latest price data is telling us is that we had a big year in 2020 for population growth. it very likely eased a little bit in 2021 as, economies were reopened up and as the benefits of urban living, started to reassert themselves a little bit. And keep in mind too, that some of the growth that we saw in 2020 was likely borrowed from the future, and that if you were on the cusp of retirement in 2020 during the pandemic, and you may have made a decision to retire earlier, not to go back to work if you were able to do so. And at that point, you moved out of the city into surrounding rural communities where it's a little bit more affordable. Well, if some of that was borrowed from, decisions that would have been made in 21 or 22, it's reasonable to expect that you'll see a deceleration of that out-migration in 2021 and 2022. And that's what this chart shows us here, is that we believe it's reasonable to expect, and based on the limited amount of data that we have so far for 2021, that the big growth rates that we saw in 2020 likely came down in 2021. We expect that to continue a little bit in 2022, and that's really just the near-term dynamics of the pandemic at play. But the important thing in this chart to highlight is that in 2023, 24, 25, and beyond, even if only the pre-pandemic levels of population growth reassert themselves, you're still looking at population growth in the range of about 1% to 1.5% for these surrounding communities. And again, this is stronger than we've seen many times in the past, right? So on average, over the last 3 decades, rarely have we seen periods of growth like this sustain over long periods of time. And as a group here today, as a workshop, we'd be looking to seek your views and what you think in terms of what might evolve going forward. But we believe it's reasonable to expect here at this stage that even if these pre-pandemic trends reassert themselves, we're looking at very strong population growth going forward. And this will have an impact on the housing market, which has already seen quite a bit of change, but also in other areas of rural development. So anything from renewing infrastructure to municipal and provincial service delivery in these regions will all be impacted by these very strong growth rates. Okay, so I just have a few more slides here.
Hey, John, you
Am
have
I
2 more
over time?
minutes.
2 more minutes? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. I'll end it right here then. I don't need to say much more. I'll just have one more chart here for consideration, is that when it comes to construction and residential construction in these markets, if you look at the pre-pandemic period here, 2002 to 2015, population growth tended to match housing completion growth over that period of time. But if you flip over to 2016 to 2020, when population started to accelerate, you can see we've got a little bit of a decline here in completions, but we've had a big increase in population growth. So it's all to say that we've got disequilibrium right now in the housing market. Construction is not keeping up with supply. We've got house price appreciation that's very strong. And because of that, housing affordability in these communities is decreasing. And this is something that we have to keep in mind as policymakers. Okay, sorry for going over time, and I'll turn it over to the next presenter.
Yeah, thanks, John. As I mentioned at the start, we're going to hold questions to the end. There is a question that came in if we're going to be sharing the slides. The plan is after the workshop to share the notes from the breakout room discussion, as well as to share the slides on the Rural Ontario Institute's website. So thank you. So with that, I'll pass it over to you, Mitch.
Okay, fantastic. So thanks for that, John, and thanks for passing along, Mike. I will try to stick to the time limit, but feel free to cut me off. So I'm with Strategy Corp, which is a public affairs and consulting firm based out of Toronto and Ottawa. We do a lot of work with municipal clients. In fact, a number of municipalities on the call today have worked with us. I run the Public Policy Institute, where we put together white papers and research papers for clients and on a pro bono basis that attempt to sort of marry good public policy with political insight. And so drawing on my former role as the head of policy for the Premier of Ontario, and in my current role as this, we had a paper that we did with the Ontario Real Estate Association, which we entitled Small Towns, Big Opportunities. And OREA asked us to evaluate the impact of COVID on rural municipalities and northern municipalities, mainly in a positive ways to what trends were happening with population growth and things that government could do to empower those communities to be able to continue to grow and to sort of capitalize, if you can if you can use that, capitalize on the opportunity that COVID presented to reverse some population trends from the past. So I'll be going over a bit of that research paper, some of our findings, and some of our recommendations. So the first part, of course, in analyzing any current trend is looking at what was happening before the COVID pandemic. And we sort of gripped ourselves with this question of how were Ontario small towns doing? Were they dying? Were they prospering? And so we really focused in on 3 different areas: population loss, employment opportunities, and then the towns that were not experiencing those negative trends and had managed to sort of buck the trend altogether. And so we started with really looking at population as one of the main parts that we were talking about. And it runs sort of contrary to some of what John was saying, primarily because this is analyzed more by individual census metropolitan areas and census divisions rather than non-urban Ontario as a whole. And so you'll see on the right-hand sort of chart there, the population census divisions that lost population in the 2011 to 2016 period, they're all rural or northern areas. A place like Huron County losing 8.5% of the population. And what's more sort of concerning about, rather than just a raw numeric loss in the number of people that are living in an area, is the age of those individuals who are leaving. And so you have this quote on the left-hand side from an Ontario 360 paper that was very well done about some rural growth issues. And what it points out is that the populations that were sort of remaining in these areas tended to be elderly. In fact, they primarily over 50. And so this is very consistent with people who were semi-retired or fully retired, but not necessarily a large stable of youth, of growing families, of individuals in the working age population who would be providing services. So bit of that sort of upside down pyramid that we hear about all the time, and a bit of a silver wave happening in rural Ontario that ultimately was a real brain drain effect of the youth leaving for opportunities, both employment wise and lifestyle. So the second sort of factor in that was, what about labor? What about the workforce itself? And so we actually had some larger municipalities, places like Peterborough and Thunder Bay, as mentioned here, where the labor force actually shrunk in the sort of post-recession period. And what we were seeing was all the data that we looked at was a widening of this gap between job opportunities in urban Ontario and in rural Ontario. And so you actually had in the decade before the pandemic, 2011 and 2019, the non-rural labor force grew by almost 11%, while in rural areas shrunk by over 15%. And in places with less than 1,000 people, it shrunk by 20%. So that, depending on where you live, in an area of 10,000 or 1,000 people or less, you're talking about as much as a 30 to 35% gap in opportunities to work. And so that was really consistent with where jobs were being created. Not only were there less people in the labor force in rural Ontario, but less jobs were being created there. A staggering stat that we talk about is in the period between 2008 and 2019, so sort of the 08 recession to the pre-pandemic period, 87% of jobs were created in either the Toronto or Ottawa areas, and a 76,000 net job loss in non-census metropolitan areas, so very rural parts of the province. And I like to use a bit of an anecdotal exercise in that Bruce County, which I like to use as an example here, which you will remember on the last slide had experienced population loss, had a 2% unemployment rate going into the pandemic or thereabouts. One of the best employment rates in the province, if not the country, unemployment rates rather. And that wasn't because everybody had a job. It was because those who were of working age were not staying in the county. So those who were staying managed to find employment, but many were leaving. So at the same time that you had a 2% unemployment rate, which would be a sign of a very healthy economy, you also saw Owen Sound, the largest municipality in the county, close one of its high schools and close 3 other elementary schools in 2017 due to lack of enrollment. So we were really seeing issues related to the age of people who were staying in rural Ontario or coming to rural Ontario pre-pandemic. Of those towns that managed to really reverse those trends and grow positively in the time before COVID-19, there were generally 2 reasons. John touched on one of them in his presentation quite a bit. But the first was a reasonable commute. You still had to drive to work 4 or 5 days a week, and that meant that you had to be within driving distance. A town like New Tecumseh, for example, which is sort of about 30, 45 minutes, depending on traffic, outside of the city of Toronto, we had research that indicated that 44% of its population, of its entire population, so that includes the elderly and children and non-working individuals, commuted every day to work outside of their municipal boundaries. So a staggeringly high number of the population. And you saw that in places like Barrie and Oshawa. I'm from a town called Oro-Medonte in between Barrie and Orillia. And when my dad first moved to Barrie in the 1980s, it was smaller than Orillia. It's now about 7 times the size. And that's largely attributed to the fact that it's within a commuting distance and it has transit connectivity. So some of the stuff that John was talking about. And then the other big push was affordable home prices and quality of living. It should be no surprise that pre-pandemic, individuals found rural Ontario and Northern Ontario a better place to live. Maclean's magazine ranks the top 50 most livable communities in the country, and 60% of those towns were places with less than 40,000 people. In Ontario, we had 3 in the top 10. I think it was Grimsby, I want to say Brant County, and the township of Russell. So really showing that there were high quality of life to be had if you move to rural parts. And when home prices were thrown into the mix, people tended to do that. So then, of course, COVID hit. And now we're talking about what did the pandemic change when it came to rural Ontario? Did it create an opportunity to reverse these trends? And are we going to see those trends become permanent rather than temporary? So there really was a push and a pull. The push John talked a lot about, and given that we did this paper in conjunction with the Ontario Real Estate Association, you can imagine how much focus there was on home prices. Really, home prices are the push factor. They are a number one reason why people are leaving the Greater Toronto Area and the GTHA and Ottawa for rural parts. As you can see by the chart, you could just compare some of these home prices, staggering differences. Mike Moffat came out and did some research after we published our paper. We published in January of this year. And he did some research and found that the most common age to move out of the city of Toronto was 0 years old, followed closely by 1-year-old and then 2-year-olds. Obviously, those individuals aren't moving themselves, their parents are, but it goes to show that when young families are trying to find more space, perhaps find affordable childcare, they can't find the type of home that they need for their growing family, and they're moving farther afield. So that really was a key trend that we saw. And if you compare year-over-year sales in the city of Toronto, June 2019 to June 2020, 10% increase in the number of sales. In Simcoe County, it was around 60%, and in Dufferin County, we had similar numbers. So really seeing large levels of home sales outside of the GTHA. And I really do love this quote that we had from a local realtor, where just anecdotally in the Collingwood area, he said 95% of the buyers that he was working with were Toronto residents who had decided they were done with the city. So really you're talking about both on an anecdotal basis and on the statistical basis that John showed, quite a lot of change due to rising home prices. The second thing was the pull factor, and that is the ability to work from home. So no matter how much you wanted to live in perhaps your hometown, like I do one day, or in a rural part of the province, you may not have had the opportunity simply because your employment was tied to Toronto. Or to Ottawa. One of the things that we were seeing before the pandemic, as John rightly mentioned, was those who could have sort of jobs that could move, so say like a teacher or a nurse where there were hospitals or schools in other parts of the province, they were taking advantage of the opportunity to find cheaper home prices. Those who couldn't were not. And the pandemic really changed that. So if you take a look at the chart there in the top left corner, you'll notice that of the industries for rural Ontario that were already existing, manufacturing things, building things, using raw materials to create things, that market stayed relatively stable or increased during the pandemic. A lot more home renovations, a lot more people shopping online, and increased demand for goods, stress on supply chains, creating real need for Ontario-based products. So rural Ontario's already existing labor force in those areas did pretty well. Where it really surprised is on that far right part of that chart, finance, insurance, real estate, and leasing. Here you had what we'll kind of call professional industries, things that work very well from behind a computer or behind a desk, boomed in rural Ontario in a way that they hadn't seen before. Because now you could work at a downtown Toronto law firm and work and live in rural Ontario. You know, I was on the radio this morning with CBC Windsor, and one of the points that was said was, you used to think you needed to have high-speed rail in order to work in Toronto. Now it turns out all you need to have is high-speed internet. And so that really is something that we've seen come throughout this pandemic. And add on top of that, rural Ontario's labor force, the way it was dispersed, it wasn't really in the retail, food services, hospitality sector in the same way that downtown Toronto, downtown Ottawa are. And so they really did not only cushion the blow, about 5% employment drop compared to a 9% employment drop for urban parts, but they also really capitalized. So you had this push and this pull, creating a unique scenario of one-time boosts in population growth, very consistent with what John said. So then our attention turned, and I'm going to spend the least amount of time here because I think this is more about what we're experiencing on the ground rather than what to do about it in the future, but certainly happy to do a bit of talking on this, and is how do we empower rural and Northern Ontario to continue this growth, to make sure that this doesn't go from just a temporary fad to a permanent trend, that these residents stay in the community and contribute to local economies and local ways of life. And so we came up with a number of different policy options, including ones that we thought would be politically palatable to this current government, which holds a high number of seats in rural Ontario and a few in Northern Ontario as well. And so so you could see some of them on the screen here about creating opportunity zones or what have you, but I'll draw your attention to a few recommendations. Don't worry, I'll summarize them. You don't have to read all the text, but I tried to capture them as best as possible. One of the big ones we talked about was opportunity zones. So this is where areas that have historically lower growth or poor economic performance get designated opportunity zones, and investors who buy assets in those areas and then refurbish them get to defer their capital gains for 7 to 10 years, as long as they hold the asset for that long. They can defer that capital gains tax owing, and in some cases even get complete holidays from them. So it really does funnel investment into these areas. And these are things like taking old motels or strip malls or what have you, and repurposing them into rental units, which are in dire need in rural Ontario, given that purpose-built rental is not something that's really happened in a lot of these parts of the province. So an interesting policy that's been deployed in the United States as a way to really funnel funds into these parts of the province to help rebuild infrastructure and build new assets. We also talked about eliminating broadband barriers. Of course, if you don't have the infrastructure you need to do your job, like high-speed internet, you simply just won't come to rural Ontario and live there because it's not an option for you. The government has actually been quite active in this space, introduced legislation a few months after the paper. I won't say there's a direct correlation, but I hope that there was some push in that direction, and they've been very aggressive on funding broadband and natural gas expansion. We also talked about office relocation. So, we have the Rural Ontario Institute hosting this in Guelph. The ministry, a lot of the civil service that works for OMAFRA is in Guelph, a great example of the types of things you can do to relocate to some of these parts of the province, especially considering that a large number of civil servants could work from home now. We talked about small business tax reduction, given that there's a lot of small businesses in the area. And then finally, one of the things that we found was this sort of brain drain of young individuals who are leaving rural places to find jobs or education in other parts of the province, and they don't necessarily come back. So we talked about financial incentives to help recent graduates come back to rural or Northern Ontario. So that could be a tax credit if you do so, or perhaps an even more generous OSAP program for those who return for a certain period of time. And then we also talked about expanding the current 5-year rural and Northern immigration pilot to cover more municipalities to help get some skilled trades professionals and other individuals into these areas who may have been in shortage, like, for example, doctors and other healthcare professionals. So you can find that report on our website if you just go to strategycorp.com/institute. I also believe it's in the link to the panel today. And if you're interested in the stuff we do, I will give a quick plug. If you just go to strategycorp.com and type in your email address, you can get our podcast and our monthly newsletter as well, where you can follow along with some of the stuff we're doing. So Mike, hopefully that's within time, but that pretty much does it for me in the presentation, and I will turn it over to you and Cody.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Mitch, for a great presentation. I know I've referred to your paper a few times throughout the pandemic to understand these trends. I felt it was really well done in terms of providing an overview of the pandemic-related rural migration trends and their economic development impacts. I particularly liked how you contrasted pre-COVID rural trends with kind of pandemic-related COVID trends. So thank you very much for taking time to share it with us today. As I mentioned, we're going to have a bit of time for questions at the end. I'm I'm now going to pass it over to Cody Jordy. He's the Director of Economic Development with Dufferin County. He's going to provide us with a on-the-ground perspective in terms of what he saw within his municipality related to these rural migration trends and their economic development impacts. So over to you, Cody. Thank you.
Sounds good, Mike. Just give me a thumbs up if you can see that all right. Perfect. Okay. Yeah, thanks to everyone. And as sort of mentioned, I am with Dufferin County, but that's only new in the last couple of weeks. I had worked for the last almost 5 years in Huron County in economic development, where of course employment, housing prices, those sorts of things are certainly topics on the radar. This is a presentation that I had given about a month ago, largely based on that anyway. And just wanted to sort of talk about what our experience had been in Huron and what the challenges were and kind of where we were going to give some boots on the ground type perspective. So the first thing I'd mention is back in 2017, we started to hear some things that were concerning. And what's interesting about so I would call these the hearing the canaries. Certain things, again, anecdote, but enough anecdote eventually turns into a trend. So we were hearing from buyers that they were interested in our area because they had been told drive till you qualify. So they have good jobs, but they don't have the equity or an income level that would allow them to buy closer to the GTA. So we had people commuting from the edge of our county all the way to Kitchener, Waterloo, Guelph, and in some cases, downtown Toronto. Realtors, when we would bring them together and talk about what they were hearing, we were starting here to hear more often, the people who are buying here aren't from here. And that's probably not surprising for many of you. Landlords were telling us, hey, prices are going up. Maybe we're thinking about selling. And they're selling to people that are then buying, which, as Mitchell was pointing out, that means our rental conversions, at least in Huron, were high, and there wasn't a lot of new rental development going up. Renters were telling us, more and more. And again, these are things that we started hearing 2017 and just have gone. They're common knowledge now, but in 2017 they were just little anecdotes. And so renters were saying there's no places to buy and whatever, or to rent, and whatever there is to rent, the prices have been jacked up. And of course, employers, I'm sure many of you, but in the 4-county labor planning board area, so that'd be Bruce, Grey, Huron, Perth, our number one issue there was employers not being able to find enough people. They couldn't fulfill all of their obligations, all of their business development opportunities because they couldn't find the people. So the other thing that I'd mention is sort of the things that we were hearing on the streets. Again, our ability to gather data specific on this and sort of non-anecdotal was challenging. So we were hearing a lot and increasingly so people moving to the region because they could work remotely. That exploded obviously during the pandemic, but we'd started to hear that before then. Or people just moving to their cottages, along the lakeshore. They already had a place in the GTA, sold that, and then just moved out to their cottage, and they could semi-retire or completely retire if they did that. We heard a lot about young families buying sort of on the lower end of the market from more urban areas, London, Kitchener, Waterloo, and Toronto, looking to move out here, start over again, either have kids or sort of bring their kids up in the country. And, people are selling their homes, moving here again to the cottages, like I mentioned, and a lot of new developments in our area are hitting the high end. They're aiming for the high end of the market. And so a lot of what I'm going to talk about here is actually about affordability and income. A couple things to note in Huron County. I'm sure it's not overly different in other places, but in Huron County, about 2/3 of our people, are married common law, and about 1/3 of them are not married and not living common law. So in essence, that's like saying, for every 2 homes, one is a single income earning home and one is a dual income earning home. And some of the data that I'm going to talk about here in terms of affordability, again, it's based on the 30%. And obviously the upper end of that affordability market is sort of capped at that 44% market ratio or income ratio for lenders. But, anyway, when I'm talking about affordability here, I'm really talking about the 30% mark, but knowing that the upper absolute limit is 44% anyway. So the average, again, this is sort of the local, what we see. So in 2016, the average house price being sold in Huron County was in the 265 range. Now that's Huron and Perth data, but we didn't have any data to show us that Huron was vastly different, either anecdotally or not. In 2020, that number had moved up to 474, which is a significant jump. But in May of 2021, we were getting data from our realtor board that showed us, those numbers were hitting 616. So that's good if you own a house and you don't plan to move, but sometime you want to retire and you're not going to buy around here. But if you weren't, if you were looking to get into the market, that was incredibly problematic. So to keep apples to apples in comparison, I'm going to talk about what a household earning income would be, again, based on 37 and a half hours a week. So a household in 2016 would have had to have earned, in order to reach that affordability test, just shy of $32, which is good. I'll show you that in a minute. But then in July, if we look at the July 2020 numbers, that number moved up to $56, almost $57 per hour of household earning power. And in May 2021, we're approaching 74. So we're well double we were in 2016. Now that's not necessarily a problem if you can afford it. But if we look at the average household income in Huron County, in 2016, it was about $66,000. So that would translate to just shy of $34. So if you think back to the previous slide, we're okay there. But in 2020, certainly the household income had gone up to almost $73 or $73,000, and that would translate to about $37 an hour. That becomes a problem when you start to look at what the actual household is earning versus what you would actually need in order to have an affordable mortgage. So you can see in 2016, the average income was $2 more than what was needed, which means things were comfortable, things were affordable. And in 2020, so when you start to hear about things not being affordable, these numbers certainly are exactly what people are talking about. So what the income was in the $37 an hour range, and what the household needed was about $57 an hour. So that's short by almost $20. That's quite a bit. And if we extrapolate sort of along the same gradual household income earning increase over time, and assume the household income was about $38 an hour in 2021, but we know that the mortgage affordability would be $74. So we're well beyond affordable at this point. So to put it in a graph, this is obviously what it looks like. So blue is the household earning income, and the orange line sort of zigzagging up is the actual price points on an average per month, again, for the Huron Perth region. And you can see, it's not that any number is a problem, it's the growing gap between the two that became a huge economic development issue. Just again, for context, to put this into context for everyday people, these are the top 9 most commonly held jobs in Huron County. Probably not that overly different from other communities: cashiers, counter attendants, retail salespeople, teachers, nurses, that sort of thing. And of those top 9, only 2 of them actually make over 25 an hour. So if you think back to the 2020 data and you have 2 full-time earning incomes, if they were both earning $25 an hour, then you're close to the affordability test. But if you think about the top 9 most common jobs, and only 2 of them are actually making at least half of what you would need to make in order to buy a house, you definitely have a challenge there. Again, in context, so of our top 50 most common jobs in Huron County, only about 19% of them actually make over 25 an hour. And just for reference to sort of ground truth the data in terms of current numbers. So these are job postings for our region and what the position was and what the income pay scale was. And you can see that the vast majority are well under $20 an hour, let alone under 25, and only 2 are really passing the $25 an hour mark. And those happen to be in healthcare. Also interesting, if you think about all those single income earning households, we don't have, of the top 50 most common jobs in Huron County, not a single one makes over $50 an hour. So if we were to put this numbers, and this is a bit of an extrapolation, if we were to look at all those top 50 jobs and we were to assume, half those households are single income earning and half of those are dual income earning, this is roughly what the affordability scale would look like across our income spread. So you can see, these are our number of households. So, almost 1,200, would be able to afford something in the 125 range. So this is again, that 30% test. And I've got down there, what that would look like in terms of monthly rent, largely based on, rent's going to follow prices to a large degree. As you can see, obviously, we've got a bit of a bell curve with a bit of a weird gap in between. And again, this is just extrapolated data. When the census comes out next year, when that data comes out, I'm sure we'll be able to fine tune these numbers. But obviously, this isn't alarming because if you look at the average sale price, anyone to the left, anyone to the left of that black line can afford the average and anyone to the right can. And that's a problem, although it is mostly in the middle, so we're okay. But in 2020, you can see we've skipped right past the spectrum all the way to the end. So that means the average working and the vast majority of people who are working and don't have large equity already aren't going to be able to make that affordability. Obviously, down to the base economics, right? We've got, at least in Huron County, and I think part of this workshop is about trying to figure out, is this does this data resonate with all of you? Is what we see is we have a housing demand issue in terms of pricing, and the issue is that we have high demand. Outward migration, is obvious to us at the local level, and we have, as John mentioned, demand or supply that just can't keep up at the moment. We talked about and have gathered, data, and these are sort of anecdotes that, a lot of people have been talking to us about what are driving these demands in Huron County. So we've got, strong economy and a strong housing market across the country. So being able to sort of go from here to somewhere else and hope that you're going to have more affordability seems to be something people don't necessarily think is reality. Our proximity to the GTA, even being 2.5 hours away, still seemed to have a major impact. And then, that was pre-pandemic, and obviously the work from home and the pandemic has made things more difficult for us. It's good and bad. There's a double-edged sword there. Obviously, we have historically low unemployment across the country, but specifically in the region that, for example, Mitchell was talking about, Bruce, Gray, Huron, Perth, low unemployment, low interest, and Canadian immigration levels obviously continue to drive some of that demand for us. One of the things people talk about is, well, what can we do about it? And I think sometimes people perceive this issue as being insurmountable, and I don't think that's true. We do have, at the community level, 4 primary tools available to us. So land development policies, additional supports and for social housing, financial incentives, and just the ability to build more houses. The challenge with some of these is land development policies are passive if we're trying to deal with a sudden and immediate issue. They tend to take a while in order to work out some of that. Additional supports, obviously the money for that has to come from somewhere. That's either from our property tax base or ultimately through grants from the province or the feds, which really comes through the income base. Financial incentives are much the same way. They obviously, that money has to come from somewhere. And so my argument for all of you, at least if you have a housing issue in your community, is to really look more at how do we get actual more development, more housing within that market your residents will need. A couple of key takeaways, at least from my perspective, is things have changed over the last 50 years. It used to be if you had a good job, you'd be able to get a good home. It's not always the case. But if you owned a home, you're probably doing pretty well because its value is appreciated. But if you haven't owned a home in the last 5 to 10 years, you definitely have some challenges in terms of affordability. Certainly the trend is alarming, I think, for us on the ground on how to deal with this problem. And as I mentioned, a good job itself isn't enough anymore to guarantee that you'll have adequate home housing. And that ultimately at these income levels, if these income levels reflect your community, it means you need a lot more housing sort of south of that 400,000 mark or around, sort of below the 1,500 monthly rent. And my argument for all of you again is, if we're going to solve this, we need to take some bold action, or we just need to accept our reality. And with no further ado, over to you, Mike.
Yeah, thank you very much, Cody, for sharing your experience and knowledge in terms of what you've seen on the ground in Huron County and soon to be Dufferin County as well. Thank you to all three of the speakers for sharing your research and analysis on the rural COVID migration trends and their economic development impacts. As I mentioned at the start, we have time for a few questions. We'll probably take about 10 minutes for questions. So one has already come in the chat box, so maybe we'll start with that. If you could please pose your questions in the chat box, and if we don't get inundated with questions, feel free to also just turn on your microphone and ask questions if I open it up. So this one comes from Ellen Sinclair. It's to all three speakers. So Northern Ontario population has declined, but their housing prices have increased significantly. Can the presenters explain this?
Yeah, I can go first on this one if you want. So one of the things that we came across specifically in the paper, we did a small section on Northern Ontario and its unique challenges. The Northern Ontario Policy Institute had done some really good work about the housing issue in the north isn't actually an issue of supply. There's more supply, and that is primarily because of the reason you mentioned, population loss. There's more supply per person than there is in Southern Ontario, but that supply is not up to code and it's not up to standards of people who are looking to move there. So this is more dilapidated infrastructure that needs significant investment to fix up, say, faulty foundations, needs a new roof, that kind of stuff. So that was the main finding of the Northern Ontario Policy Institute. And so we put forward some chatter about, say, a home renovation tax credit or something to that nature, specifically for Northern Ontario, or investment to that impact. But that's one of the big factors, is though there is housing, it's not housing that meets the standards that people are looking for. So might be an answer to a bit of that question. And I can dig up the report and maybe send it in the group, because it's quite useful for finding some of the answers to that imbalance between population and prices.
It's John here. I'm just going to piggyback on what Mitch just said there. The very latest data that we have, though, would suggest that maybe population trends have changed a little bit in Northern Ontario as well. And what we've seen is a domino effect in the province, where people migrating out of the GTA go to surrounding communities, and then people in surrounding communities then sell and move further afield. So there's a little bit of a domino effect going at work in the province, and that's pushing house prices higher in some of these further away communities. And it's really people that were already in rural regions that are capitalizing on this environment and moving further afield. So some of that might be going on too.
Thanks, John. Cody, I'm not sure if you have anything you want to add to that or.
No, I just saw a question in the chat. I'm happy to address though.
Okay, is that the question now from De'Aaron Johnston?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll just read the question. How is building more housing without significant shifts in development policy, including tiny homes and other innovations, going to make houses more affordable?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and certainly I think those things need to be looked at. There are challenges when you look at that development, but certainly I think those things need to be looked at. You know, if your community doesn't have, for example, additional dwelling unit, if it doesn't allow that as of right, you know, that's something that community should look at, and that might involve, you know, the addition of a tiny home, and again, sort of how we define that. There's some discussion there, but the point is that what we have is a lack of supply, and that supply, unless things change, isn't expecting to disappear anytime soon. So if we want to bring affordability back into check, we need to build more houses. It's really a supply and demand issue.
Thanks.
Yeah, I'll jump in on that a little bit, Cody. Agree. I think, you know, we're talking about some serious red tape issues in the housing sector. I mean, you look at the municipal zoning order issues that are given out by the province, which I know are quite controversial, but they're only doing it in circumstances where municipalities have asked for it. You know, we're talking about a process that can take 5 to 10 years for a subdivision to get approved at a municipal level. And in some cases, there's legitimate reasons for that. In other cases, it's process. So we really do need some red tape fixes there. We talked about in the paper some common definitions of subdivision, some things like that. And the other big one is the conversion of properties. So COVID has really exposed a lot of these commercial properties, strip malls, and those types of plazas that may not be as needed in the future as they were in the past, especially as people move to online shopping. A really interesting opportunity to look at some of those businesses as places that can be converted into rental housing or built into new mixed use developments, especially considering that a lot of those plazas would already be in central locations, would already be on major streets, and probably have access to transit, and would certainly have access to infrastructure like water and gas. So we're seeing some of that in some municipalities. I know Sudbury is doing that in its mall, for example. There's one mall in Sudbury that's being converted into mixed use, and I think you'll see more and more of that across the province.
Yeah, thanks, Mitch. So we'll go on to the next question from Eric Miles. What is the bigger barrier to new housing construction? Is it municipal/NIMBY opposition to development through onerous urban design guidelines, heritage conservation efforts, and appeals, or lack of skilled trades to keep up with construction demand? And as a follow-on to this, how can these issues be overcome?
I'll maybe start on that one, but that's a whole other webinar. That's a whole other webinar. But I mean, I would say largely it's a combination of all those things. For example, you know, again, in Huron County, one of the things that, you know, when I was talking to developers, I would point out is the vast majority of their developments weren't developments even their own workforce could afford. And they were short on their workforce. They couldn't get enough carpenters and general laborers to work for them. So I think it's a combination of all those things.
Yeah, I would say in rural parts, you've got a real skilled trade shortage, like a serious issue, especially with the capacity that we're talking about. You know, every individual who's moving in is looking for renovations in some capacity, but in the urban areas, I think it's almost surely the opposite. It is really a NIMBY issue, and it's a not in my backyard issue. We're talking about it's legal to take an existing house in Toronto, tear it down and build 2 smaller houses on the same lot. But if you wanted to turn that house into 3 rental units, that would be illegal, and you would need to go through the whole municipal process to get approval. So we really have some issues when it comes to creating affordable rental housing in urban areas. In rural areas, I put it a little bit less on NIMBY, although that's certainly a factor. and a little bit more on just municipalities that haven't had to deal with this much demand and request at once, and some skilled trade shortages as well.
Yeah, thanks, Mitch. I think we only have time for one more question before we move to the second part of the workshop. For those outstanding questions, feel free to reach out to any of the speakers after today's session if you would like to get further insights or continue the conversation with them. Mitch, John, and Cody will also be joining the breakout room discussion. So if you're in a room with them, there'll be a chance to ask them questions at that time as well. The last question comes from Jason Dennison. Any comments or research or insight related to student temporary in-migration and the impact to housing? And he goes on to say, Peterborough is a college / university town, and we have lots of dialogue going on.
Yeah, I mean, I can take it more generally. I mean, probably not so much on the impact to housing. It's not something I'm entirely familiar with, although I'm sure it exists on rental capacity. But I would just say I've done a lot of work for the college sector, and they really have had to rely on international tuition. An international student pays around $40,000 a year in tuition, and a domestic student pays between $3,000 and $7,000 a year in tuition. So it is a substantial difference. However, this really is an interesting way for some of these colleges that are headquartered in rural and northern areas to bring in new individuals to the region. If they come to Ontario to start their studies and they have to finish at an institution in say Peterborough at Fleming or at Northern College or what have you, the likelihood of staying in the area increases dramatically and becoming a part of the community. So we talked about ways to get domestic students to return to Northern Ontario, return to rural Ontario. I think we should be looking at ways to get international students to stay once they come here for their studies as well.
Yeah, thank you, Mitch. And thank you, Mitch, John, and Cody again for your presentations. I'll maybe just say one comment about the student in-migration. It's not directly related to your question. With the online schooling and post-secondary students, doing schooling remotely, I'm sure that it had a positive impact on rural communities, because you didn't see the exodus of a lot of those students to urban areas for the start of school, because most of the post-secondary institutions are in urban communities. So the second part of the workshop is to discuss the migration trends you, the participants, are seeing in your communities and the economic development impacts. So we're going to use breakout rooms to have the discussion in smaller groups. Each of the breakout rooms will have a facilitator assigned to lead and moderate the discussion. There are 3 discussion questions that we want to work through with the time remaining. Those were shared with participants in advance of the workshop, but we'll go over them again. The facilitator will take notes, and then we're going to have some time for report back, and the facilitator will do the report back on behalf of the group. If we're running a little bit over time, if we do get pinched for time, know that the plan is to take notes in each of the breakout rooms, and those notes will be shared through ROI's website in conjunction with the PowerPoint presentation. So we really hope that you'll stick around for this part of the workshop. It is an opportunity to hear, what are we seeing related to these migration trends in different regions of the province, and what are some of the more immediate economic development impacts? So it's really a chance to better understand this and have a conversation about it. So we have about 50 minutes now. I'll say we'll do, about 25 to 30 minutes for the breakout rooms and about 15 to 20 minutes for the report back, and then just a quick wrap up as well. So with that, Brianna, if you could break us out into our breakout rooms. Yeah, so please stick around and continue the discussion. All right, welcome back, everybody. And thank you for those that have stuck with us to this point. I know the breakout room that I was in, we had a great discussion. I'll kick off the report back. We have maybe just over 10 minutes for the report back. So as I mentioned before, the facilitators are going to lead the report back, and they're going to touch on some of the key points that that were discussed in the breakout room. So in my room, I did have representatives from Northern Ontario, Eastern Ontario, and Southwestern Ontario, though there's probably the majority of the people were from Northern Ontario. And I believe unanimously across the board, participants felt that, yeah, they were seeing, you know, an increase of population in their communities kind of since the pandemic. A lot of it they felt were retirees, and a lot of the communities where people work that were in my room are in more, let's say, amenity rich areas, like areas where there's a lot of waterfront, and saying that, yeah, it has really affected home prices. There's been a lot of prospectors coming up and buying, you know, vacant land, you know, waterfront properties as well. And subsequently, a lot of the local real estate has become out of reach for local buyers, and especially for first-time buyers. There was a feeling that homelessness has increased as well, and there was more than one participant that, you know, mentioned that within their communities, congestion has also increased and has changed in a lot of these communities. That was brought up as well. And you know, further impact, again, the majority of the conversation was around affordable housing, saying that, you know, for first-time home buyers, the reality of purchasing a house it just doesn't exist anymore. So, you know, to me, that's a bit surprising, especially because a lot of the focus was around areas of Northern Ontario that have tended, you know, my understanding, to have lower real estate prices. One of the participants also said that, yeah, they did feel that there's been a bit of an increase of newcomers to their communities, be it new immigrants as well too. So that's quite interesting. That's my group. Maybe with that, Jeff Kinsella, can I pass it over to you for your report back?
Sure. So just not to repeat what you heard, because I heard almost exactly the same thing, but to sort of build on that, some interesting observations that came out. One of them is that we need a range of housing. That affordable is one thing, but if you're going to retain people in your community, you need to have a whole range of housing options. But another interesting observation was that young singles and seniors often need the same sort of housing, the same types of housing. And if you start to approach it and look for commonalities, you might find that there are different ways to talk to your developers so that you can get them interested in developing different kinds of housing stock. Something else that came out was that some employers are now looking at supplying daycare and housing to their workers. So they're looking for different options for actually like living on premises and moving back to almost dormitory style stuff, I guess. So that makes some challenges for sort of how the legislation is in place right now. And another observation is that a lot of the people who are moving in, a lot of the newcomers, are retirees, obviously, but also commuters. There's a lot of people who are moving out from the city, so they're not contributing to the housing stock either. So it isn't just the retirees' influence. The influence is much greater in a lot of areas than you would think. And as far as sort of how the data is being gathered, there's lots and lots of meetings and communications. Some people are using published data, CMHC, StatsCan sort of data. A good mention, one of the people uses our analyst tool. So that's really important, and I wanted to bring that out. It's a great tool. And but a lot of that is regular meetings. So there's lots and lots of regularly scheduled meetings with realtors, with different stakeholders, and lots of regional meetings so that the information is passed swiftly between the people, and the communication is really good. So I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. I think that's it for me.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. One point I wanted to make as well from my group's discussion. One of the participants was from Prince Edward County, and you know, I've read this in the media about Prince Edward County as well, to say that businesses have had to cut their hours back because they can't find employees, and the main reason is employees can't afford to live there. So I'm sure others have heard that as well and read that about those happenings in Prince Edward County. Anyways, Lisa, maybe I could pass it to you.
Sure, thank you, Mike. And also just in our group, we also discussed a lot about housing affordability and issues like struggling with rentals for locals in rural areas. But something that was quite interesting, I think, was about school closures. So we discussed how the influx of school closures, but we had someone in our group from the London School Board, and she was pointing out that when people are looking for a new home, they usually look for school's reputation. So where people are not moving there, so they are still experiencing low demand for schools, because not because of the lack of people, but because people want to move specific areas and not to other areas because of the reputation of the school. So I thought that was really interesting. We also discussed about how commercial development and how big box stores are impacting local businesses and driving them to closure. So that influx of newcomers in communities is promoting commercial development, but we also discussed that it is important to provide support to local businesses so they can keep working.
Yeah, thank you, Lisa. Catherine Osterban.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, I'll try not to duplicate what we heard already. You know, really a lot of similar things. A lot of, you know, communities are, well, you know, I had folks from across the province as part of the group, and really, you know, a big influx of retirees seems to be what's happening. A lot of course, urban people moving into the rural areas. Some of the things that, just kind of building on that school board piece, you know, what we're seeing is kind of the reversal of the trends that had been taking place, you know, in the previous 5 years, where we saw school boards were closing schools because the number of students in the area were shrinking, and now it's kind of the reversal of that trend. So how do we keep up with the growth in students there? It was interesting, one of the areas, so one area was close to Ottawa, and they said most of the retirees were maybe not coming from, or were retirees from a government job, so they weren't really looking to re-enter the workforce or contribute in that way. In other areas, it was kind of, you know, semi-retired people, or sometimes there were professionals that were contributing into the community or filling in gaps or increasing that skill base. And kind of a positive that perhaps we haven't heard yet is, you know, yes, housing is definitely becoming much more unaffordable, and you know, certainly it's a challenge for young people to afford those houses, especially if you're working on that hourly wage. But the increase in housing prices leads to an increase in tax base, so then there's more money available to kind of invest in some of that community infrastructure as well. Let me just see if there's anything else that I wanted to pull out. It also has led to an increase of traffic into the downtown. So there's been some new businesses popping up. And, you know, we had folks that mentioned, like, when there was an increase and businesses were able to pivot and get online, they did really well. Some of those businesses who were not able to pivot and operate online because of, you know, the various restrictions that were in place in their capacity, they weren't able to really leverage those trends. So it was the opportunity to bring in new business and new ideas, and also some new spending in the community as well. And yeah, I mean, one of the other concerns that folks heard was, you know, with residents, and will they change the culture? Will they want those urban amenities? And, you know, that those fears haven't really materialized in those areas at this point. And I think I'll leave it there in terms of some of the key trends that we chatted about.
Yes, thank you, Catherine. How about Mike Marcolongo?
Sure, I'm going to build on the previous comments as well. The not all our speakers or our participants have seen these same trends. I think in particular we have a political leader from Brook Albinston, which is essentially between London and Sarnia. And as an agricultural community with no significant recreational amenities, not being on, for instance, on Lake Huron and so on, they're not seeing the influx of new residents, unlike other participants in our session from Blind River or Thessalon. But what was the common theme there was that the isolation of rural, so less things to do in the evening, the challenge with getting doctors or health practitioners in the community, the price of fuel, and other challenges sometimes dissuade people from staying in those communities in long term. So that was raised in our session. As mentioned previously, yes, we're seeing an influx of older retired folks, and unfortunately, something that was highlighted in our session was the human capital challenge there. So these residents these new residents are coming in. Yes, they are supporting the local economy, but they're not bringing that human capital need that the community requires. So they're not only coming in, but they're also displacing some residents that have that human capital potential or contribute their human capital because they're also displacing the rental market, as some of these landlords are selling off their rental stock because of the attractive prices that they can fetch in the market at this point in time. In terms of some of the data used to track the trends, yes, we heard the analyst and the rural dashboard, and this is something economic developers often use, is building permits. Definitely see an increase in building permits in a lot of communities, and the municipality is able to track who's applying for those permits. So in Thessalon, for instance, it's mostly new residents to the area. But one of our session participants also highlighted the informal networks. So there's a golf course in Blind River, and it's a regional draw. Our political leader there is getting a lot of information through golf course talk and chatting and those networks, as well as the Chamber of Commerce. That's all we heard from our session. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mike. Thank you to the facilitators, and thank you to all the participants as well for sticking around for the breakout room discussions and sharing your insights about what you're seeing in your communities related to these trends and the economic development impacts. So I'm going to pass it to John and Ania now, just given we have only 2 minutes left, and he'll say the wrap up. Over to you, John.
Thanks, Mike. And I just want to mention that a summary of the breakout rooms is going to be compiled, and we plan on summarizing all of the views that were shared with us at this meeting, because that's what really we wanted to do here. And we will post them along with the presentations today on the ROI website. So if you want a summary of the conversations that occurred in the other breakout rooms, you want a little bit more detail, hopefully we'll have a document there ready for you guys, and it will be posted on the ROI website. And also, just in closing, just want to mention that the three presented today, Cody, Mitchell, myself, if you have any questions with regards to the materials in those presentations, feel free to reach out to us directly. We'll be happy to chat with you about any of the material that was in those presentations. And just want to say a big thank you for everyone who helped organize the session today at ROI and within the ministry as well. And my other two presenters, it was a worthwhile session for all of us. So thank you everyone for joining us today.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.